This is the LUMIX S1 Mark II, and it is incredible. It has the fewest compromises I've ever seen in a camera, contains every feature I've ever wanted in a hybrid mirrorless, and executes the majority of those features better than the competition. This is a special one. Let's get undone.
Gerald Undone. He's crazy.
What's happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and I am an existential threat. First off, for disclosure, LUMIX lent me this camera to make this review. It goes back when I'm finished. They didn't pay me to make this video or get to preview beforehand. I was not involved in the press trip surrounding this release, but 2 years ago, LUMIX did fly me to New York to consult on a theoretical future camera, and I believe this is the camera we were discussing at that time. This video does have an actual sponsor, and that's Condor Blue, and their fantastic new cage and accessories for this latest line of LUMIX cameras. There's actually going to be 3 cameras in this series. First was the S1II that I reviewed in February, and now there's this camera and also an S1II. They're all using the same body and carry the same features. The only difference is the sensor. So that means across all 3, you'll get the same excellent image stabilization, external capabilities, ports, buttons, battery, cooling solution, improved autofocus, and the awesome flip tilt articulating combo screen. The S1II will reuse the S5IIX sensor, but stick it in this new body and add all of the new functions and features for a small but not inconsequential price bump, bringing it to around $2,500 US. This new camera, the S1II, is getting a 24 megapixel partially stacked BSI sensor that I can only assume is the same one we saw in the Nikon Z6 III, which means much faster read speeds than the other 2 cameras in this lineup. Now, this camera will be more expensive than the Nikon equivalent, but by the end of this video, I think you'll see that the price difference is warranted. This camera actually feels like the spiritual successor to the S1H, but it's much cheaper than that camera was, and instead comes at the same launch price as the original S1, but with much more to offer. Now, because of the improved read speeds of this partially stacked sensor, this camera is capable of some interesting and impressive resolution and frame rate options. There's actually 19 pages of them in the menu, including dozens of variations on 4:3 aspect ratios for anamorphic, but I'll try to condense that down and just give you the highlights. So you've got 6K 3:2 open gate recording up to 30 frames per second, but they've also added a 5.1K oversampled, uncropped open gate that can record up to 60 frames per second. This is a huge deal for open gate shooters, and I don't think any other hybrid cameras are offering this combination of resolution and frame rate for open gate. In 16:9, you can shoot full frame 5.9K up to 60 frames per second as well, and if you shoot 4K, you'll oversample from that 5.9K. The 4K 120 is cropped though, roughly a 1.24 times crop in 16:9 mode. The image quality is also reduced a bit, so you might be better off just going into APS-C mode for 4K 120. But they've also added a new mode called CS 4K that can shoot up to 120p while maintaining the full width of the sensor. This is made possible because of the reduced vertical resolution. It's basically a 2.4:1 crop to improve read speeds, and it's a clever way to offer a full width 120p mode. So what about the actual read speeds in each of those modes? Well, first off, you need to know that there's a dynamic range boost mode on this camera. This isn't some expansion mode like on the S1R2. This is a full dual circuit simultaneous read mode, so the camera merges the low gain and the high gain circuits together to create one high saturation, low noise image when DR boost is enabled. Now, when you do enable it, it significantly slows down the sensor, so it's not available above 30 frames per second, and in my opinion, is better suited for static shots. It is something you can choose to toggle on or off at the lower frame rates though, which is nice. So in 6K open gate with DR boost off, we can read out the entire sensor in 14.9 milliseconds. This is very good for an open gate mode. After the rolling shutter fiasco with the S1R2, I made a video showcasing what different rolling shutter speeds look like on screen in practical scenarios. And while the amount of jello you can personally tolerate is subjective, it did seem like most people agreed that anything below 15 milliseconds was acceptable. I also feel that way, and so I consider this a good result. However, if you enable DR boost, it slows way down to 34.2 milliseconds. This is the penalty for reading a 15 millisecond sensor twice, and then a small added delay for merging and processing. Now, 34.2 milliseconds is not good for quick handheld camera movements. You will see the artifacts, and they will bother most people based on the comments of that rolling shutter video I made. But the reason why I'm going to give this camera a pass is because unlike the S1R2, which lived in this in-between space where the fast modes weren't that fast and the slow modes didn't improve the dynamic range much, this camera actually gives you 2 clear and valuable use cases. You have a slow mode, which does have a noticeable dynamic range improvement that we'll get to soon, and then a fast mode that offers a significant speed boost, making frenetic movements possible. And the best part is, neither mode has bad dynamic range. This is how you bifurcate camera use cases. Good job, LUMIX. The 5.1K open gate mode is slightly faster at 14.3 milliseconds, and the 5.9K 16:9 modes are faster still at 12.6 milliseconds, given that there's less vertical resolution to scan. And you'll keep that 12 millisecond speed in 4K up to 60p as well, because it's oversampled from that 5.9K mode. If you turn DR boost on in the 16:9 mode, the read speed will slow to just under 30 milliseconds. Lastly, the 4K 120 mode, which does have a crop, reads at 6.9 milliseconds. Now you'll notice that these speeds are a tad slower than the 9-ish milliseconds I got on the Nikon Z6 III. But when you see the dynamic range improvement, even with boost off, I think you'll see why. My guess is the Lumix is reading out at a higher bit depth than the Nikon, which is paying dividends in dynamic range. For my dynamic range tests, I use a chart called the Xyla 21, which has 21 patches of light at varying intensities that when filmed will show how many stops of light the camera can capture at once. But the enemy of dynamic range is noise, so I use software called Imatest to analyze the noise levels in the darkest patches to see how many of those detected stops are usable. Normally, we look at the medium 0.5 score, which represents a signal-noise ratio of 2, and will tell us how many of our total detected stops are good and clean. And if we start with 5.9K on a 6K timeline, so no oversampling is being accounted for, I shot in V-Log with noise reduction turned all the way down in camera, and at the base ISO, which is 640 with dynamic range boost off, and ISO 1000 when DR boost is on. And in this worst case scenario, we can see 14 stops total next to slope-based DR, and a medium score of 12.1. This is a very good result for DR boost off, better than some cameras get in their best case scenario. But if we enable DR boost, the total stops detected jumps to 14.6, and because of the dual gain circuit merging, we get much cleaner shadows, driving the medium score up to 13.1, which is fantastic. Now, some of that can be attributed to the H.265 codec, which does suppress noise on its own, but we can also shoot ProRes internally on this camera to mitigate that inflation. And even in ProRes, we get a medium score of 12.4. But this is 5.8K footage. If we stick that on a 4K timeline for oversampled results, we get a 12.9, which is one of the best results I've ever gotten for ProRes. But jumping back to H.265, if we stick that 5.9K image on a 4K timeline, we get 13.4 stops on the medium, which is crazy good. And you get the same result if you oversample internally on the camera and record 4K up to 60 frames per second. The only time you don't get a stellar result is in 4K 120, which drops to 10.4 and has some color channel issues in the highlights. But as I mentioned earlier, you might want to just commit to APS-C for the 4K 120 because then you'll get 11.2 stops and fewer color issues. 4K 120 is really the only thing this camera doesn't nail. Up to 60 frames per second, it's probably the best hybrid camera I've ever tested. So if you go into it thinking of the 4K 120 as more of a bonus, I think you'll be quite happy. Now let's take a look at the ISO range. With DR boost off, starting at ISO 640, you can see we get a very clean and pleasing image all the way up to ISO 4000, at which point the dual native ISO kicks in at ISO 5000 and cleans up the image. And it stays surprisingly clean up to ISO 25600. It might actually have the best ISO 25600 I've seen in a camera like this. Hell, even ISO 51200 doesn't look that bad. But the best part is, there's practically no color shifts even when comparing 51200 to ISO 640. Next, if we enable DR boost, we no longer have dual native ISOs because both are being used at the same time all the time. Instead, the range goes from ISO 1000 to ISO 25600 as the upper limit. Now, something to note is that on the back of the LCD, it gives the appearance that the image cleans up going from ISO 6400 to 8000 with DR boost on. And this does seem like a logical place for it to happen since this ISO range starts 2/3 of a stop higher. But this is only present on the LCD screen, not in the actual recorded footage. When this camera isn't recording, the LCD screen shows a lower quality standby mode that cleans up as soon as you press record. And for some reason, this standby mode also applies a bunch of noise reduction to the LCD screen when going from ISO 6400 to 8000. But if you press record, switching from ISO 6400 to 8000 no longer shows any difference. And I even ran the images through Imatest and the results were the same. No second native improvement, which makes sense because you shouldn't be able to switch to the second native ISO if you're using both at the same time. So just a weird quirk on the LCD screen. Anyway, if you compare some key ISOs between the two modes side by side, you can see the DR boost on is cleaner at base ISO, at ISO 6400, at 12800, and even slightly better at 25600. Colors on this camera are great. Well, actually, if you let me rant about that for a moment, color is a topic I find very confusing when people talk about it. When I say the colors on this camera are great, what I mean is when I work with them to get them where I want them, they're easy to work with, robust, and hold up well. I don't mean they're accurate, but that has little to do with the sensor quality and a lot to do with how the image is processed and what conversions are applied. For example, I think V-Log and V-Gamut are great to work with, but if you apply the manufacturer's LUT to the footage, it's not even remotely color accurate. And this isn't just a Lumix problem, it's most brands. Color space transforms and DaVinci Resolve are a lot better, but even the CST for V-Log isn't quite up to snuff if we're talking about perfect color. So I've started making color accurate LUTs. I already have some for Sony and Nikon, and now I'm introducing my V-Log LUTs as well. They come in two variants, a low contrast version that will match the intensity of the manufacturer's LUT, and the in-camera view assist tools, allowing you to dial in the contrast you want in post, but now with nearly perfect color. And then I'll also include one that has a stronger curve applied for people who just want a one and done LUT for quick turnaround work or previewing. Check this out for example. See that blue cup? It's supposed to be a much deeper blue, and the lights in the back hallway should be bright yellow, not a dull orange. The manufacturer's LUT is getting this all wrong. But if we apply my LUT, the colors are fixed, skin tones look great, and even the asparagus on the plate has much more punch. This is how it looked on the day. You can really see it here if you look at the color chart. And the best part is, these LUTs will give you one-step matching between camera brands. Here, look at my Sony camera with my LUT applied, and here's this new Lumix with my LUT applied. Very similar image with only one step. So check out my LUTs using the link in the description, and I'll even include 33-point monitoring LUTs if you want to load them into your camera or monitor. Thanks for listening. Now while we're comparing these images, let's talk a bit about detail. I compared this new camera to the Sony a7 IV, which is a higher resolution sensor, but I wanted to see how this could compete with my current A-cam. Not exactly apples to apples, but I was impressed that Lumix managed to keep up. The Sony is certainly a bit sharper, but it's also a bit more processed and doesn't have adjustable noise reduction. So you end up with a slightly more polished image on the Sony, but it's also more rigid and sterile. The Lumix, while a bit softer, has a more filmic quality right out the gate, which I find pleasing. Now the other aspects of this camera, like audio, stabilization, and autofocus, have already been covered when I reviewed the S1R2 in February. They're all excellent. This camera will get the 32-bit float internal recording using the same XLR module, so that's awesome. Lumix has my favorite audio functionality of any of the brands. The stabilization is the best in class, and it's not even close. This camera also has the 3 levels of electronic stabilization, which basically let you run with the camera on wider focal lengths, and the cropless mode removes any of the corner wobbles on those wider lenses without even reducing your field of view. It's fantastic. You can also use medium focal lengths for follow shots, and the electronic stabilization will give you a surprisingly smooth experience. It's the closest you're going to get to a gimbal without actually using one. This time around, I even tested the Boost IS for static handheld shots. I lazily handheld the 7200 in APS-C mode, so we're getting just over a 300mm equivalent, and it turned me into a human tripod without even trying. The autofocus also did well here to track the rabbit, even when obfuscated by the grass. I complained on the S1R2 that I didn't understand marrying such good IBIS with a camera that had bad rolling shutter. Well, in this body, it's a match made in heaven. The best stabilization available on a sub 15 millisecond readout shooting 5.1K open gate at 60 frames per second is an insane proposition. And the autofocus is getting better and better with each release. I've already felt quite confident using it full time for talking head with the last couple of cameras, but it's really starting to mature into a very competent system. The issues I had with the S1R2 are gone, and they even added a new urban sports mode for tracking human subjects doing weird poses that would otherwise trip the system. I'd say the only thing this system is lacking is an auto subject switching mode rather than having to choose manually. And a simplified touch tracking function would be nice to see as well. I do miss my Sony cameras where I can just tap on something on the LCD and the camera intuitively knows that I want to track that object without needing to change modes or press any other buttons. This camera has an object tracking mode, but you have to switch over to it, and you can't use it when you're just in the standard full area AF mode that you would likely be in for face detection. It also isn't class leading when it comes to low light subject tracking. It's only good for up to 3 stops underexposed at most. Anything below that and it hunts like crazy. But on the flip side, overexposure is not an issue. Your face can be completely blown out and it'll stay locked on. If they could improve low light tracking by about a stop and add an auto switching mode, that would remove the bulk of my concerns. But the fact that I'm being this nitpicky about AF improvements should indicate just how far the system has come and how nearly complete it is presently. Now, there are some quirks with HDMI and subject detection still. Subject detection does work in all modes when no HDMI device is connected, but if you're using an HDMI monitor, you'll lose subject tracking in 4K above 60 frames per second, C4K or CS4K above 96p, and any of the higher resolution modes above 30p. This is annoying, and I hope they can find a way to solve it eventually. But HDMI latency on this new line of cameras is much improved compared to the previous generation, so that's good. Oh, and they also finally added UVC webcam capabilities over USB-C. So now, just like Sony, you can connect your LUMIX S1II to your computer using a USB cable, and it shows up as a video capture device, and you can stream or record or Zoom call up to 1080p 60 or 4K 15. It's easy, works well, and I'm glad they finally included it. My only gripe is that they're a generation behind Sony and are capped at 15 frames per second in 4K. I found this weird when Sony had this limitation, but luckily they eventually moved past it and started offering 4K 30. I hope Lumix can too. Just like the S1R2, you have a CF Express Type B slot and an SD card slot, and you can record redundantly between them for the modes that are supported, which on this camera is the majority of them. It's really only the high frame rate all-intra modes that require CF Express, but even for those modes, you also have the option to record to an external USB-C drive if you want. And this camera doesn't have any of the quirky limitations of the S1R2 regarding battery grips or special dummy batteries to unlock those USB-C recording modes, which I'm really happy to see. And speaking of all that, let me show you the new accessories from Condor Blue. So since Condor Blue is sponsoring this video, I'm gonna go ahead and assemble this cage around this camera and tell you about some of the cool features about this cage while we do it. So my favorite aspect by far is how they designed the cage around the strap eyelets here. So the cage parts actually slide right into those, giving you a really strong, rigid, anti-twist design. They also put this mid post here that adds a lot of rigidity and strength to the cage, which is great. And then it's just a couple simple screws to hold it in place. And they actually include the tools on the bottom of the cage. The cold shoe on top has a safety pin, so your devices won't slide out. There's over 30 threaded holes all around the cage for 1/4 20, 3/8, and M4. It's designed to protect the camera from the most common drop angles and comes with a lifetime warranty. There's also a rosette on this side, so if you want to get optional accessories like Condor Blue's grip, you can attach that there, which even has its own record button. And of course, monitor mounts, which can be attached to the top with RE locating pins to make sure that your mount won't twist. And the sides and top feature NATO rails, so you can attach hand grips like this one, which I absolutely love. This is the Condor Blue top handle that also has the ProBlade SSDs. So you can attach this along the top NATO rail and you can record externally to this USB-C right from the top handle. And because, like I said, this S1II doesn't have any of the, limitations, the regular battery will allow you to record all of the modes to that SSD. But if you do want to use a dummy battery, you can use the purple Gerald & Dunn BLK22 battery eliminator. And of course, you can still use your XLR module when you have the cage attached. And these cages are shipping right now at the link in the description. Battery life is also a lot better on this camera than I was getting on the S1R2. I was able to record for just over 2 hours in 4K 24 on a full charge, and open gate recordings were lasting about 15 to 20% longer as well. And unlike the S1R2, this camera didn't overheat in open gate mode. On the S1R2, I experienced shutdowns due to overheating in open gate after just an hour and 18 minutes in a climate-controlled environment that I usually keep around 22°C or 72 Fahrenheit. With this new camera, I was able to record 6K open gate for 5 hours using USB-C power delivery to keep it juiced up. I had the fan set to medium, but I didn't even get an overheating warning. After 5 hours, I just shut the camera down due to boredom. The only modes that did give me a warning were the 5.1K open gate and 5.9K modes when shot at 60 frames per second. They started flashing a heat warning after about 90 minutes, but I was still able to keep recording for over 4 hours before I went to bed. They never actually shut down to heat. And that was using the CF Express card. On the S1R2, I had to use a dummy battery and USB-C recording to bypass the heat limits. Now, I'm sure hotter environments will yield worse results, but I would certainly call this thing reliable for climate-controlled spaces, and it still features the same workaround potential that helped on the S1R2 if you find yourself in higher ambient situations. So let's put this all together. This is a 24 megapixel photo camera with excellent specs in that regard too, even though we didn't dive into them in this video. But a 24 megapixel photo camera with video functionality that includes some of the best dynamic range this side of a cinema camera, very fast readouts when rolling shutter is more important than dynamic range, class-leading image stabilization, reliable autofocus, the best audio solution on a mirrorless camera, great low-light performance, extremely versatile recording options from open gate to anamorphic with varied and redundant ways of storing those clips, a full set of exposure tools like waveforms and false color, and it resolves my 3 biggest issues with the S1R2. The dynamic range expansion, rolling shutter conundrum, the battery life, and the overheating. They're all improved here. I like this body. I love this screen. It's all the aspects everyone loves about Lumix cameras, but now with no compromises. Every part of this thing is great, and it comes in at $3,200 US, a price cheaper than the last camera that gave me similar feelings, the Sony a7S III. That camera was $300 more than this one 5 years ago, but this one is higher resolution and much more feature-rich. The only thing that it can't compete with is the 4K 120, but everything else over here is the same or better than the Sony camera I call the technical masterpiece. So I'm not exactly sure what to call this camera, considering that I probably like it more than the a7S III, but I am confident in saying that I don't think there is a more well-rounded camera available, and it has instantly skyrocketed to the top of my list of recommendations. No camera is perfect, but this is as close as you can get. All right, I'm done.